Hello, welcome. Thank you for participating in this, my project, my life's work. My name is Christopher Lee Ware. Many of you know me as chaplain. I'm a hospice chaplain with Harbor Hospice, but I'm also a doctor of ministry candidate at United Theological Seminary, and this is the culmination of my work, spiritual wound care for the soul. I am a self-professed and proclaiming spiritual wound care practitioner. It is a model of tending to one's emotional being that I have developed. That's what I plan to share with you today, having taken a journey of healing, this work beginning with my own woundedness from my own childhood. Actually came out in the seminary classroom when I had a rage inside of me that wanted to hurt a classmate, and I didn't understand why. And later I found out that rage, that deep-seated pain and anger within inside of me was from a woundedness from my childhood that I had buried. And when that came out of me in the spring of 2012, that's where began a journey of not only my own healing experience, but the birth and the beginning of spiritual wound care for the soul. And that's why we're here today. Because I believe that all people have been, are, or will be spiritually wounded or grieved. And that ungrieved grief, unidentified spiritual wounds will become historical spiritual wounds. And that these historical spiritual wounds diminish one's capacity to be spiritually and emotionally available and engaged in the present because they are emotionally and spiritually bound to their past. Foundationally, I've looked at some work in 4 areas to support my thesis. Biblically, I looked at John chapter 20, verses 19 through 25. Jesus is resurrected and he comes into the upper room. And the text says that he says to the disciples who are gathered there for fear of the Jews, it says that he says to them, "Peace unto you." And after he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. And then it says the disciples were happy when they saw the Lord. And again he says, "Peace unto you." What caught my attention in this text, that as Jesus approached them with a word of peace and looking for a reciprocation of peace that he had given them back in John chapter 14, he noticed that they didn't respond. They didn't recognize him. They didn't see him. They were bound by the fear from their past. They were bound by the fear that 3 days ago he was crucified. And so 3 days later, they were still dealing with the immediacy of the fear and could not experience the present moment of the resurrection. And what Jesus does in that text is he uses his own woundedness. He shows them his hands and his side so that they would see that it was truly him. He reveals his wounds. And then they were happy that they saw the Lord. I believe that for many of us, people don't see us and we don't see the real, the true, the authentic identity of others until we have seen their wounds, until they have revealed. Not that we've seen them, because I can see people's wounds, which in the Greek, that is the word aora, or visual, or blepo, to see something. But there's also the Greek word idion, which is translated see, and that word means to experience. I can see your wounds, but can I see your wounds? And so I believe it's not until we actually see someone's wound that we see the true, authentic, and the deepness of a person. Historically, I also looked at Antoine Boyson, who is the founder and the presenter of CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education. He had a issue in his childhood that he went to his family and other friends with, and they seemed to diminish his emotional being and gave him some ideas and things to do to alleviate it and have it go away. Well, he in his entire life, he sought to marry a woman. She would never marry him. And he ended up with schizophrenic breakdowns and was institutionalized. And while he was institutionalized, he himself said that he didn't believe that he was receiving treatment for his whole being. They were taking care of his mental stability, maybe his physical, but he saw himself also having a spiritual side that wasn't being tended. And thus, he began to bridge the gap and magnetize and bring closer together medicine and ministry through psychotherapy and compassionate pastoral care. And I, too, in my work, desire to bring closer together medicine and ministry so that we can tend to the whole person, which is what many of our institutions' model of mission and vision is. So I studied him because he had these challenges of being institutionalized at different points of his life. And I believe that he was running from this childhood woundedness. And it wasn't until this woman, who he sought his entire life, when she died, he had one final breakdown. He was institutionalized for 3 weeks, and he was never institutionalized again. And he lived another 35 years. But I believe that many of his mental, emotional instability, grieving, painful issues weren't from just present day issues and events of life, but it was this historical wound that he had buried when he was a child that he tried to avoid at the coaching, at the advice of others. Theologically, I looked at a theology called Han. It's a Korean theology that deals with a diagnosing of woundedness. And what the Han really looks at, which I found very fascinating, was the Korean people had been oppressed by the Japanese. And when this oppression ended, the Korean people held in their anger, their bitterness towards the Japanese. And this emotional pain from their oppression actually became physical. But how they describe it from a theological perspective, a theology of Han, is not that the emotion had an impact on their physical, and not that the emotional issue or the emotions within them became physical, but that the emotion became physical, but yet it also still remained emotional, to the point that their bowels would knot, their intestines would knot. They would find knotting in the brain that they could not explain, and they attributed these physical deformities, these physical manifestations to be Han, that the emotion actually transfigured the body, but that transfigured area of the body also was the fullness of that emotion. I like to describe it that if they were to do a surgical procedure of a Han patient and remove that physical deformity, they would actually remove that emotion from that person. They've never tried that. They've never done that. But that is the intricacy, interwovenness of the physical change and the emotional being, that it is not one has impacted the other or one has simply become the other, but one has become yet still remains. A Han theology that we can be physically impacted, but yet we are still emotionally present and still being emotionally impacted by those emotional wounds that we're holding against ourselves. And lastly, I looked at an interdisciplinary practice of nursing. And I looked at some nursing theories. And one of my nursing theories that I found very fascinating was a nursing practice theory called symbolic interactionism theory, which is when the nurses interpret the patient's actions They interpret the patient's being in order to find meaning from the patient's perspective and then respond to those actions based upon what they mean to the patient. What it also further meant, and it really talks so deeply about, was an assumed and an assigned rolling. That just because the patient comes into the facility, that person coming in is not the patient. They are assigned to be the patient, but has that person assumed their being to be the patient in that role? The same thing with the nurse or the doctor or the chaplain who enters the room. I'm assigned to be for that patient what my assignment is. If it's a nurse, they're assigned to be the nurse. But has that person assumed themselves to be the patient, and have they assumed you as their nurse? And what the symbolic interactionism theory speaks of is that the ability to have healthy, in-depth, and as accurate as possible interpretation of actions and being requires moving from the assigned roles to the assumed roles. That both persons must assume their own role and be assumed, not just assigned, by the other party. When the patient has assumed their role and assumed the nurse as their nurse, and when the nurse has assumed their role as a nurse and assumed that patient as their patient, the ability to interact, the ability to interpret is more meaningful, is more accurate, and more in-depth. And what I also found that they talked about with the symbolic interactionism theory was that having a theory of practice, not just that particular one, because what I found also very, very fascinating was I picked up one book and there were 160 different nursing theories in there. I'm very interested to find out what nursing theory you use to practice the craft of nursing, or for other disciplines, what theory do you use to practice your discipline? But they talked about that those that practice with a model or with a theory, which will give you some pattern, which will give you some order, which will give you some structure, find that their outcomes are more consistent, and their interactions with patients, once again, are more meaningful and more accurate because there's a consistency to what you do with each and every patient following a pattern, not meaning that you do the same thing with every patient, not that we do the same thing, but that we have steps that we follow, and when we don't miss steps, and when we become consistent in our steps, our outcomes, even though at each step we may have different input, when we have a consistency of step, our outcome tends to be more accurate and more consistent. So those are some foundations that I really studied to undergird my thesis of believing that all people have been, are, or will be spiritually wounded and or grieved, and that untended grief and unidentified historical spiritual wounds will diminish one's capacity to be spiritually, emotionally available and engaged in the present because they are bound to their past. And as a result, I have a hypothesis, and that's where you really come involved. Because I believe that if interdisciplinary care team members are equipped with some knowledge, some tools, and some praxis of spiritual wound care, then patient and family grieving spiritual wounds will be more often and more adequately assessed, documented, and robust referrals made for spiritual support and spiritual wound care. What am I saying? I'm not trying to turn anyone into a spiritual care professional. I'm not trying to turn anyone into a spiritual wound care practitioner, just as no one would try to turn me into a nurse or into a social worker. What I am saying is that there are some tools that I believe that this team can be given that will give them information and insight into their patient to better understand patients' grieving and their emotional being, identify it as healthy or unhealthy, and then make referrals to the spiritual care person as needed. not only making referrals when patients are deemed to have unhealthy grieving. There are many people who have healthy grieving practices that sometimes they don't even know it. There are many people who have healthy grieving practices that still need someone to sojourn with them to continue the journey, because even when the journey is healthy, we can get stuck. And there are times when the grieving is unhealthy and we are not going in to fix anyone. Maybe they just don't know that it's unhealthy. And raising an awareness to it will simply help them to identify what they want to change in their own grieving practices. And one thing that I do is I never tell anybody what to do, how to grieve. I don't believe that there is a right or a wrong way to grieve. I believe that when we say things are right, they have to be right forever. And that many people get stuck in a quandary of a decision that they've made, a choice sometimes to even come to hospice, that it had to be the right decision. And they might see a change in their loved one and want to make another one, but they're wrestling because their decision was supposed to be right. I never tell anyone their decisions, their grieving, their being is right or wrong. My language is healthy and unhealthy because we make decisions every day. And we try to make the healthiest and we try to make the best decisions that we can based on the information that we have in front of us at that time. And when we do that, that was a healthy decision. And tomorrow or later that day or in a week, we may get some new information. There may be a change of condition in the patient. And when that occurs, guess what? I get to make another decision. And that doesn't make the decision that was made a week ago or a day ago wrong. It was a healthy decision. And now I get to make another healthy decision. And maybe my decision wasn't healthy. And I can live with it. It wasn't a healthy decision. And now I can make a new decision and a more healthy decision. Maybe the decision was unhealthy because I was being motivated and I was being pushed by my emotions. I was trying to resolve my emotions with a decision rather than engage my emotions for what they were. But I believe that when grieving, when decisions, when things are healthy and unhealthy, it becomes easier to shift into a healthy practice than it does to shift from when a decision had to be right. And it may not have been the best. I won't say that it was wrong. But when it had to be right, shifting to a new decision to be right becomes much more difficult, because now we sometimes are saying to ourselves that if I make a new decision that has to be right, it really means I'm saying that my other decision wasn't. So I really promote a healthiness. And so helping our patients, helping our families, helping each other, helping anyone who is dealing with spiritual, emotional wounds of life. Spiritual wound care for the soul will help team members identify the grieving as healthy versus unhealthy in order for us to get them the help and the support that they need. Because I believe that within healthcare institutions, that there is a distance between the medicine and the ministry. That these institutions have instituted a practice that we have to choose very often to ignore what is going on with the other. The physical care team really doesn't pay too much attention to what's going on emotionally and spiritually, as long as it doesn't get in the way of what's being done physically. And many spiritual care providers don't really look at or see much going on with the patient physically. But what I believe is that really treats the person as a bifurcated individual, a physical half and a spiritual half, when we are really one whole being. And we want to bring medicine and ministry closer together so that we can support and care for the patient and have an impact on their present life and even on the present end of life journeys that many take. Because what we see when we see and are caring for our patients and each other very often is only half of what there is. No cure that fails to engage our spirit can heal our soul and make us whole. Viktor Frankl said that. And many of our healthcare institutions have missions and visions that speak of caring for the total person, for the whole person, even creating healthy families. So even going beyond the patient, knowing that there is a family connected to this patient that we are also looking to care for. Which is why I believe spiritual wound care for the soul is so vital and so important, because even as we are caring for the patient and managing their physical needs, there's very often emotional and spiritual needs of the patient that can be referred when assessed in a more healthy, robust, and in-depth way. And that's where my team comes in. As chaplains, we may see patients one time. We may see a patient once a week. We may see a patient and no family there. But there are nursing staff and other disciplines who are around 24/7, and they see patients and families at times we don't. And their ability to see the things and be an eye and an ear for the emotional and spiritual well-being of those patients and families means that not only as they are tending to the needs of their patient physically, or by cleaning the room if they are part of the environmental cleaning team, or if they're dietary and they're bringing food, nourishment for the patient and family, but they can also see if the family to them is presenting healthy or not healthy, and make a referral to get them support, which in turn improves the total care that we provide for our patients and family by getting them the care that they need for their whole family, for their whole being. That's what spiritual wound care for the soul is all about. And I bet you're wondering, why is this spiritual wound care for the soul and not for the spirit? You know, many of our companies are faith-based, and even in healthcare, we have faith-based institutions, churches, mosques, synagogues, we have healthcare institutions. We all talk about whole care. We all talk about family care, human dignity. And there's physical, emotional, spiritual, and social needs that are involved in all of these arenas. But we have physical needs, and we have spiritual needs. And what I believe is that when we care about the total person and we see a person as a whole being, what the soul is, as I define from the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verse 7, and it says, "The Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground," that's flesh, "and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life," that's spirit. "And then man became a living soul." You see, I believe that it is the connectedness of the spirit and of the flesh that create the soul. So I cannot care for the spirit without impacting the flesh, because it's connected in the soul. You cannot care for a patient in their physical body and not have an impact on their spirit, because there is a connection in the soul. And so to understand that anytime we are caring for a patient, we are impacting that total person in some way, because we are touching their soul. We cannot touch their flesh. We cannot touch their spirit without having an impact on their soul. And that is truly why I believe that physical care, medicine, and spiritual care, ministry ought to be magnetized, brought together when it comes to the caring for patients and families and carrying out the mission and the models and the visions of our institution to meet the needs, to care for the total person. This is what spiritual wound care is all about. So now, let me show you what I've developed when it comes to spiritual wound care.